everyone. I'm Jennifer Day. I am Associate Professor in Urban Planning in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. So welcome to our first session of the Southern Design Seminar Series. Today's session is on customary land governance in small island developing states, and it's a panel discussion from three different scales or three different geographies. So I begin this proceeding by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which this event is taking place, which may be multiple lands given the location of all of you. I'm currently speaking from the Wurundjeri land, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and the past and present, and the place of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. So we're excited to launch this new international research seminar series on Southern built environments. The Global South, broadly refers to regions of Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Oceania. While such an understanding is often challenged, the term has undergone a shift in definition and understanding from a limited focus on development and cultural difference to its emphasis on decolonization and geopolitical power relations. And so we're looking in this seminar series to offer an alternative narrative to globalization and challenging the homogenization of cultures and societies. So that's a few words on the seminar series. We're supported by the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning and by the Melbourne Center for Cities. So thank you, Melbourne Center for Cities, and thank you, Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. And our goal is to showcase research in our own faculty. So our own researchers, today we have two staff members from Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning, Alexi Trundle and Janine Felsen. And we also have an associate researcher who's located in Port Vila, and that's Willie Misek. So I'll introduce each of them very quickly, not covering nearly any of the accomplishments of any of them. And then we'll have a 10-minute presentation by each of our panelists and followed by a Q&A, and we'll have you out by the time you've finished your lunch at 1 o'clock. So I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished panel. Willie Misek is the national project coordinator for the UN Food and Agricultural Organization in Vanuatu. Willie supports the Vanuatu Climate Action Network. In addition to his role at FAO, he's a climate activist and a youth leader. And an interesting fact about Willie is that he is the first ever recipient from Vanuatu of the Queen's Young Leader Award, which was awarded by Queen Elizabeth II at Buckingham Palace in June 2015. And that was on some of his work on community development and water in Tanna, the Tanna Island of Vanuatu. Dr. Janine Felsen is a research fellow with Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, although I'm not sure exactly, Janine, what your title might be now. I'm not sure what the status of MSSI is. So maybe you can give us a little update there if you feel like it. Her primary focus is on integrating global policy for sustainable development, climate change, and the ocean through new or improved financial frameworks and governance structures. Prior to joining the University of Melbourne, she worked as Belize's Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations. And in that role, she developed an integrated approach across the development, environment, and security agendas on behalf of small island developing states. So she has a very interesting background, which we're excited to have in our faculty now. And last but not least, although who will be speaking second, is Alexi Trundle, also Dr. Alexi Trundle, who's the Assistant Director International of the Melbourne Center for Cities, which is a new research institute center on our campus, and he's housed at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. His research focuses on the way that cities are contributing to the UN 2030 agenda for sustainable development, as well as climate resistance and adaptation planning in Pacific small island developing cities. He's led the development of urban resilience and climate adaptation planning for Honiara and Port Vila. So thanks all of you for being willing to come to our research seminar. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Willie, who will speak about Port Vila. Willie, I had a message from you on the side that said you needed to see your notes. Would you like me to run the slides so that you can look at your notes while speaking?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Sure. I'm just pulling that up and sharing my screen. And okay, how's that?
Looks good this end, Jenny.
Over to you, Willie.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for the introduction, and hi everyone from Vanuatu. I'm so pleased to be here with you online, virtually. Unfortunately, because of this crisis that we are all going through it, it's so good to know many of you from different backgrounds, and also to share about what we are looking at, especially in terms of customary lands in urban areas and in the Pacific. My presentation today is about a case of Tepakor, which is one of the cases that my family is just going through it, especially when it comes to evictions and how the customary land is being given or sell it, or even handed over from generations in Bolivia. So the case study will be focusing on how my family has been for some times living in an area, and later on having an eviction notice to evict it. And it based this presentation will also help us to look at to make a distinction between a PEM crown and PEM rent and PEM crown. So this is the two things that we are trying to understand while going to that case with our family, to see also beyond what are those customary arrangement that is being in place in the customary land, and later on have its difficulties in the current law of the constitution of Vanuatu, and lead it to the crisis of what we call the eviction. So firstly, that case study, it's between the families and the land custom land owners of Efate from Ifira Island, and the one of the buyer of the land. That the case was the case happens last year, and the communities and the family as won the case, but we're trying to also look at that case on how those eviction orders that is been happening in Vanuatu or in the Pacific as well. And just for that, in the Constitution chapter 12 of the land of Vanuatu, we have the 73 that talks about the lands belong to the custom owners, and this is one of the very interesting part of that, where we will talk. I will speak a little bit on it later on, where really establish that relationship between PEM rent, PEM crown in Port Vila. And then we have the basics 74 words, which talk about the basis of the ownership and the use of the land, and then the tenure ownership. The 75 talking about the perpetual ownership, which is one of the constitution that it's not really it's in the constitution, but not very really applicable in reality when we're talking about the land ownership in FAT. So these pictures really shows how the communities in FAT and the people that are coming in to settle in FAT started or begin their relationship on how they PEM rent or PEM crown and to settle. And it always started, as I mentioned, in that it's also in the constitution, that the ownership belongs to the custom land owners, and this is where the establishment of the settlements, mostly in urban areas in Bordilla, started by those custom ceremony where they started the payment ground arrangement with the custom land owners and the settlers on the land. And this is really a significant part of that settlement, where it's later on ignore or sort of I said ignore is because there is no that agreement between the custom arrangement with the Commonwealth law that it's governed the land settlement in the urban areas in Vanuatu. So this is the picture that shows that all those arrangements that we are seeing in Bordilla begin with this custom arrangement, and this is where give the whole signals about them ground. So many of the settlements, and including the case in Debako, was really started by that, where the landowners have that arrangement. And while the arrangement is taking place, after the arrangement taking place, that sort of agreement is really binding beyond not only PEM ground, but also for some cases, and the cases of Debako, that custom arrangement between the landowners and the settlers, also binding them on the long-term relationship as well. Like this, in that case, the landowner, which is Edward Pakokodo, told my father at that time that going back to the history, looking at the history of the World War II, where the people of Tana come to Bordilla to fight during the World War II, and because of that, there is that arrangement of saying you can settle down here, and using that word "stapia now." Stapia now is something that more and more when we speak within the family to find out how the settlement is being started, and that word "stapia now," which is means stay here, and it could be interpreted in different way, but the way that the family has in terms of the settlement, stapia now means is the staying here but forever. That is the settlement that is gone forever. So this arrangement from the customs and then going back to the history allows that settlements to the family in the area. And as we know, over time, thing changes when other come in. And after the Edward Pakokoto passed away, his son coming in and then changes the whole agreement around not just only Stabia now, but going to PEM Crown, where this way of settlement they settle in the based on the custom agreement, and then agreed on a living for staying forever, and then suddenly there's changes over time. Maybe this is because of people need some money to survive in Bordilla. And when it came to that place, they didn't tell anyone about the dates when, and what I knew is that comes Tapia now, because I knew that when PEM ground would come stop now, yeah, there was no end date, as I mentioned earlier, and I would pay for the land continually. And this is sort of something that when we're looking at the constitution and how the custom arrangement has been going, the PEM ground becoming some sort of other way of looking at those settlements in the urban area, especially when the urban area started growing and taking more spaces. From that perspective, where we're looking at that, as I mentioned, when Edward died, his son coming in to Kipagokoto, and told me that 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 is what we see is as a statement from one of the settler, and especially it's from my father, and when his son came, told him to leave because he want to sell the land. So later on, the family going through that challenges of see that there is a sort of game changer coming in, where is Jackie Pakoto, and then tell them that he want to sell the land, so he want them to move out. And the thing is that Edward never told them to pay crown or them crown, but when Jackie came in, that all things have changes, and then there is a new all arrangements coming in with the communities and the families. So suddenly the Stapia now changed to PEM ground, and the community continued to PEM ground. And interestingly, looking at that, the way of PEM ground is really looking at PEM ground in a perspective of PEM rent. So the new when Checky coming in with a new perspective of paying crown because he wants to sell the crown, then he started a new all agreement, and from that the new way of paying crown coming in, and that was on rather than paying crown, but they are using it as a paying rent. So some of the fees has been going out and putting out and start asking the family to start paying for the settlement. So here we can see how this arrangement it's been going, and that was the breakdown of PEM rent that is been given to the court at that time. That we can see that from different witnesses. When they have an agreement, and also how much they pay for just build the house, and then later on a monthly rent that is been coming into that agreement. So they pay for settlement, they pay for a monthly rent, and if they have businesses, they also pay a monthly fee of the businesses as a rent to the custom land owner, which is Jackie. So those different members of my families in the area continues to pay the rent to Jackie for some times, and this is really something that it becomes later on that they don't even knew about it, but later on becoming a sort of constitutional case when the family continue to pay the rent. So when we looking on that, it brings back us to that question of revoking tenure, customary tenure. When in that case that has been going to the court, it is not uncommon that in the Pacific that a customary arrangement would be renegotiated. What is changing is the suite of reasons that a landowner might give to move a community along. In the case of a city that is connected to international flows of capitals, these sorts of opportunities are becoming increasingly common. So in the case of Tepaco, notice to vacate was given to the occupants or my family with commercial development given as the express of interest, because as I mentioned, Jackie came in with his express of interest of commercial development and saying, now we need to move you from this land to another place. So they given that notice to the communities and saying that you have to move in some certain period of time. And this is quite interesting because when we're looking at the Tepakoro case, that really bring up the question of this constitutional to become a constitutional case, as I mentioned. And we're looking at the Tepako is it's becoming a sort of places where you can live in it with some sort of customary arrangement, and then it's not safe. And the appeal court judgment we demand the decision back to the lower court about this directive to consider additional evidence that has been made. And it's quite interesting because when I personally looking at the judgment really brings back the families back to looking at some other evidences on those settlement. If this is constitutionally, this is a constitutional case or is unconstitutional as well. And it's quite interesting because when we look at the difference between PEM rent and PEM crown in urban setting, according to the law, there is that common interest when people are moving in by an arrangement and then start developing the land and paying rent. And that difference really makes that PEM rent in a constitutional way by PEM rent that the families in the Tepako do, it's quite different, and it's so expensive to PEM rent for the case in Tepako compared to the constitutional way of paying rent, because you're paying on a yearly basis, but that one is on a monthly basis, and it's so expensive compared to any lands in Efate and in Podela. And this is where that interest, whether it's constitutional or unconstitutional, come in, and how the families share the common interest on that land, even if the custom owner thinking to sell it back to the crown. So the question also raised in that place, in that way of constitutional, whether it's constitutional or not unconstitutional, it's interesting is because if we compare the rental fee that the family is paying for the last 40 years on that land with the land value, it's beyond that. And this is where we raise the common interest on that land when it comes to that settlement, to move from custom way of arrangement and arranging with a PEM rent, and looking at that on an horizontal way with in parallel with the constitution of Vanuatu in terms of land and the lease land lease act as well. So friends, I think this is the end of my presentation about PEM rent and the distinction between PEM rent and PEM crown, whereas it becomes clear even for the family when we start to understand more that case, that we have spending a lot of money paying rent, which is really equivalent of PEM crown. But unfortunately, this arrangement from the beginning of the custom arrangement with custom land owners and the settlers, according to the custom arrangement, also never recognized by the Constitution when it comes to land lease act. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Willie, for taking an incredibly complex situation and giving us some insights into it. We'll go straight on to Alexi and Janine, and then we'll have question and answer at the end. So if you've got some questions, please drop them in the chat or write them down or just remember them. And so Alexi, floor's over to you to take us across the waters to Honiara.
Thanks, Jenny. And I'm just conscious that we have some people here in the room. They're actually sort of sitting around me. It's a bit of it. We've gone for a very complicated hybrid setup and some tech issues. So thank you for those who are physically on my left and right. I will try to look at you, but also down the barrel of the camera at the same time. Retrospect, you're right. I probably should have sat over there. The original intention was to look at that camera. Thank you, everyone, and thanks, Jenny, for inviting me along to this. And thank you, Willie, for providing such a detailed insight into a perspective on living in, around, and as a migrant to customary land in Vanuatu. I think that's such a powerful insight and something that I certainly can't provide as an outsider. My name's Alexi Trundle. I work primarily around, as Jenny mentioned, in terms of climate resilient development in Pacific Island cities. So I'm coming at this very much not as someone who lives this day to day, as Willie does, and has such a rich and real experience of what this is. But what I'm hoping to do is to provide a little bit of insight in terms of how different forms of land tenure intersect with the different types of climate resilient development programs and how they impact on the way that we measure as people who are more familiar with the science and with some of the statistical outcomes of urbanization with that particular interface with whether or not resilience as we understand it certainly is occurring in the same ways under different tenure arrangements. What I did to begin though was to provide a bit of a provocation and I think there's a lot of stereotypes as to what Pacific cities are or what they aren't. One of the first things I really wanted to emphasize was that there are Pacific cities, and that's something as outsiders that is often ignored, and particularly through climate resilient development finance streams and the kinds of assistance internationally that are provided, it doesn't really come up. So I just wanted to touch on that as an outsider and reflect on that to begin with. The second sort of stereotype that I wanted to challenge is of sinking islands, which often is such a powerful narrative in the climate space, and there are others who write very powerfully about whether or not that is a performative necessity and demonstrating that vulnerability at a global scale in terms of climate negotiations and the impacts of that on the actual lived experience on the ground. So there's just sort of two footnotes, I suppose, that I wanted to introduce this conversation with from the perspective of looking into the Pacific from the outside. As Jenny did at the beginning, and it's tradition here in Australia, I wanted to particularly acknowledge that I'm on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I think that is a complicated conversation when it comes to what custom land is, particularly in terms of other First Nations contexts in the Pacific. But what I really wanted to emphasize is that there is more than a century of colonization that has a profound impact on what cities are, particularly in the Pacific. So this map is from the League of Nations after World War I. The Pacific and what were formerly German states and a number of other settings were basically carved up. And for those who are more familiar with settings such as Africa, you can see the parallels in the way that these arbitrary lines are just drawn along latitude and longitude. One thing to note, and you can see in the language there, and this is 100-year-old language to the year, so bear that in mind, but I just wanted to emphasize in red some of the ways that it's described, held not under complete sovereignty of any power, and I'll emphasize that word in particular, but as mandates under the supervision of a group of nations. And of course, the way this actually played out was blackbirding and South Sea Islanders, effectively slavery by another name, the extraction of huge amounts of resources, the strip mining of islands such as Nauru, and of course, in our own context in Australia, widespread genocide across this continent directly. So I think it's really important we acknowledge that. But what I also wanted to emphasize is that cities are sites of radical exclusion of customary land tenure, and they have been, as for that 100 years, positioned predominantly prior to independence as sites for colonists to enforce their control over these now nation states. And Willie can talk much better to the experiences of that and the progression of that since independence through the one or two generations that have succeeded that. But as my good friend Sarah McCartney and Professor John Connell from the University of Sydney note in that bottom left box, this is effectively a legacy of colonial apartheid policies that sought to exclude inappropriate natives from urban residences. And that's sort of obviously pointed language about that was used at the time that I definitely don't support in any way, but it reflects, other than the note on apartheid, it reflects the division of customary land tenure from urban environments. So I think that's a really important starting point, particularly as a descendant of colonists here in Australia that benefits from that legacy of privilege directly. So where does this leave urban identities 100 years later? And I think there's a really complicated tapestry here that I just wanted to sort of dig into a little bit. This is a picture of Honiara from last year, November last year, in fact, and the burning of what is still referred to as Chinatown in the center of the city. And we saw a lot of narratives about what that is here in Australia, whether it was, China against Taiwan or, great powers at play. But a lot of this fundamentally comes down to a very large youth population that exists in cities that have very limited urban economic opportunities. And there is an underlying tension between what is a really complicated set of interrelationships between customary groups, tribal groups. There are a number of different ways that that's expressed, that migrate to cities for economic opportunity. So these are some of the words that you'll see here. Boy house is an interesting one that I just wanted to emphasize, because I think it's really important to also highlight not just colonial expression and neo-colonialism, but also gender in these settings. A lot of the initial migrants from other islands to these areas were men, and that's before you sort of overlay the very strong male presence in the colonial invaders that then settled in those areas. So you have a very complicated sort of gender setting that I mean, I don't want to go too much into these identities, because I am primarily trying to talk about climate resilient development and their intersection with different forms of tenure. But I did just want to really sort of set this out, because I know for our viewers online, and maybe for some people in the room who are less familiar with the urban settings in the Pacific, they are quite complicated inter-ethnic relationships that interplay with colonial settings, and they're very much not entirely negative. So some of the things on the screen, you know, Manblower is really about finding an urban identity. That's something that has shifted over time, and there are really strong, rich urban identities for both migrant populations and sort of reparations with customary landowners that are very much live and in place. I just don't have either, you know, I think this one shouldn't be me having these conversations. We'd love to talk about this later in after the panel, but two, I think that's a totally separate talk in and of itself. But there is an element of resisted urbanism, both at multiple levels. So one of those is in the identities of individuals who live within the city, who still primarily identify with what are often referred to as home islands. This is particularly in the archipelagos of Melanesia, but also some other atoll-based island states in the Pacific. And there is a level of agnostic neglect, I suppose, within government, because these are not areas that have either customary connections, but they also often, due to non-transient electoral boundaries, don't have the same clout in terms of political electorates as some of the rural areas as well. And that, of course, filters up into the financing mechanisms, to the point that they aren't areas that are acknowledged or have dedicated streams, despite representing large portions of the population, which is what I'm just about to go into next. There are, of course, many positives associated with these spaces. They are melting pots of languages, of the 900 plus languages in Melanesia, for example. They're heavily represented and interplay in these cities. Young people are attracted there for a reason. There's a richness of culture, of economic opportunity, of education, and of things like activism, and very in a more positive light than is reflected in that photo. So just to further complicate the situation, these are the different trajectories of urbanization for each of the Pacific Island countries from 1950 to around 2015, and then their projected trajectories going forward. This is just to note that this is sort of a very rapidly evolving situation. So this region is urbanizing, but some sections are 100% urbanized, close to in Micronesia. Polynesia is sort of tracking more closer to the global average, and there's some big caveats on the Melanesian side of things that, again, I can go into later and have gone into in papers and other things that we don't need to go into right now. But just to note that there is an acceleration of urbanization that it is a permanent feature of the Pacific. One really critical example of this is in Solomon Islands. So I mentioned before there were some riots last year. There were echoes of a period known as the ethnic tensions that occurred at the turn of the millennia, from the late 1990s to the early 2000s. That led to a very large regional task force intervention within that state. But primarily that was seated around the complicated interplay with the customary landowners of Honiara, the Gwale, and large migrant populations, particularly from Malaita, which is a very large island immediately to the north of Guadalcanal, which is the island in which Honiara is sited. The reason I just wanted to show you this piece of work is the underestimation of urbanization is something that occurs in everything from just general narratives to the literal projections of urbanization rates. So the figures that you can see there that are sort of shaded in those three colors are the official projections of growth to the middle of this century that were released by the Solomon Islands National Statistics Office, with whom I've had many conversations about these figures, trying to figure out where they came from. And it was a consultant who came from Europe and then disappeared that they don't have the contacts of anymore. However, what I really wanted to emphasize was this assumption that urbanization would slow. So what you can see from the middle point of that chart to the right, in black is the national rate. That's based on some very sound projections of maternal birth rates, death rates, and that tracked fairly closely in terms of what was actually observed from 2009 to 2019. What was not expected was the continued acceleration of urbanization. So the dashed lines, the orange one is what was actually observed as the rate of urban growth. And the red one was the rate that was observed in Honiara. So 10.5%, 10.15% annual growth. So that's a huge increase in population that we're talking about. Now, for a city that was effectively tore an entire country apart and led to, to be completely sort of pragmatic about this, $2.5 billion of Australian aid over the better part of a decade being funneled into the country, it is amazing that we continue to still underestimate what was the biggest social disruption that this country has experienced since World War II. That's just a different perspective on it. But what I did just want to emphasize was this is the kind of change that we're talking about in some raw numbers. So Honiara's recorded population of 130 odd thousand is larger than it was projected to be by 2030. So that's its population as of 2019. Those rates of growth that are observed over the last decade were to continue. By 2030, Honiara would reach a population of 275,000. The greater area, including those peri-urban areas outside of that alienated colonial boundary, would reach a population of 329,000. So that's equivalent to more than a third of the national population. So that's what we're talking about when we say, oh, it's not really an urban Pacific, but there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's being underestimated. And that's why I think this is understanding customary tenure around cities in the Pacific is a really important focal area. This is just a more spatial for people like me who are more geographically map-minded. So this is Port Vila. What you can sort of roughly see in the center where there's sort of denser lines, I don't think I have a mouse or a laser pointer, but are the sort of the older areas of the city that were alienated through prior to independence and continue to be so. Outside of that, you see some dark red areas, and that's areas that have a rapid acceleration of population growth. So what I'm trying to basically show here in a simplified fashion, and again, if you'd like to dig into this in more detail, is that what you're seeing is that those outer areas of these cities are rapidly expanding onto what was formerly rural customary land areas and customary land holdings that are not alienated. So there's a divergence, there's an acceleration within alienated areas that have formal leasehold. And as Willie was elaborating on, there are many parts of these cities that are occupying spaces that are customarily held with very different legal situations from country to country and very different arrangements for how people are allowed to occupy that land and how they're allowed to use that land. And I should really emphasize, this is just seeing the people. That's not seeing areas that are impacted by harvesting of wood, which is primarily used for cooking by the majority of the inhabitants of Port Vila, for example, or the growth of bush gardens, which form a critical part of nutrition for the people who inhabit these cities. So this is the arrangements of land tenure. You can see in the lighter shade, these are the areas that have formal leasehold, and the red parts are areas that do not have formal leasehold. They maintain customary land ownership systems. And this is just in Port Vila where Willie was talking about before. So we're not talking about an entire city being subdivided and carved up. But as Willie was mentioning, there is a huge amount of pressure from developers and investors who are now starting to carve up what were formerly customary spaces. And that's causing huge amounts of social pressure within cities in the Pacific. So I'm going to wrap up. This is my last slide, Jenny, so please don't freak out. But this is just a way to try and break down what informality is. And I'm going to explain why this is important to begin with. But one of the things that I've just talked about was the division between areas within a city boundary, a formally designated urban area, and they have very specific forms of legislation, and the overflow. That's not a new observation. We are right now in the city of Melbourne. Adjacent to us is the city of Yarra and the city of Moreland. There are a number of peri-urban councils, and there are governance arrangements and norms for that exist all over the world. Where it becomes interesting is when you start to break that down into areas within and outside of the city boundary that are either on customary land or on contested land. So this is informality writ large. It's often just assumed that there are slums and there's formal settlements. It's a simple binary, and we don't really take it much further than that. When you start to break that down, though, you start to find that the ability of both the sort of exhibited properties of climate resilience as a concept, and also the potential for big finance mechanisms, climate finance, which Janine will go into shortly, to engage in these spaces becomes a little bit more fragmented. And actually you start to see that it operates differently and is able to engage differently in these spaces. So just as one example, this is Ontong Java settlement at the river mouth in the center of Honiara. It runs a communal leasehold for 50 odd households, a population. Those households are some of them are 20 people large. So we're talking a population between 800 and 1,000 people, all held under one communal legal land tenure arrangement. So in this particular community, they all come from the Ontong Java atoll, almost exclusively bar a few intermarriages outside of that particular group. It's a very unique community within Honiara because it's a community that is Polynesian in terms of its origin. So it has distinct languages, customary practices, legal arrangements, but it's very cohesive. So within that community, there are very easy ways for donors, for example, to engage. There are clear chiefly delineation systems. They hold the land in a communal sense, which actually operates very easily if you're, for example, trying to build a communal water tank or build infrastructure. That can be arranged with a very identifiable community structure, even though it's within a city. It's more akin to operating in rural environments, which is really where a lot of development partners are used to operating. So they're quite comfortable with those mechanisms, and it has very clear structures, which are in the top left. In other communities, however, in the peri-urban areas of the city, they have very cohesive mixed origin community structures where the communities themselves can identify every household within an area that has a population of 2,000 to 3,000 people. They map out which areas operate under which household leadership systems, and they have complicated tenure arrangements where an extended household will occupy informally a large space. What becomes problematic is when someone like the national water utility wants to come through and just bulldoze through that land, not understanding the impacts on the social fabric if they're trying to build a water supply system when it cuts through shared land that appears to be relatively vacant. Or for instance, if there are complicated arrangements with the peri-urban Gwale community in terms of using land for gardening just across the boundary that are rights that are determined through intermarriage between Gwale female heads of household, because it's a matrilineal system, and the Malaitan patrilineal system who don't necessarily recognize those rights. So there's some really important nuances just in those two examples within the town boundary. If you look outside the town boundary, of course, it gets even more complicated again, because what we're talking about today is customary land tenure, and that becomes much more fuzzy and contested and is something that has led to tensions before in Honiara. So for example, one of the communities we've worked with that's just outside an area called Gilbert Camp, this was the origins of the Malaitan Eagle Force, which was the armed resistance to the Gwale attacks on the capital. So this is literally a hotbed of the ethnic tensions that I mentioned earlier. So the Hawassa tribe claimed that they were the owners of this land, but then through further investigations, it turned out that this was actually held by the government because it was an inherited, alienated piece of land that had been disputedly claimed by Levers Corporation, which was a huge corporation that established these very large grazing areas for cattle in the peri-urban areas of the city. So none of that really provides an answer, but if you want to engage in those spaces as a donor partner, you have to deal with some really complicated arrangements. And what it does is it means that if you want to try and work in these spaces, you have to understand that it's not as simple as saying there's customary land and there's urban land, or there's informal tenure and there's formal tenure. There's a whole bunch of nuances that have very, very radical implications for how the same project could be applied in these different spaces. So that's all from me, Jenny. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, Alexi. That is a wonderful characterization of the different layers of formality and informality. So it's absolutely fantastic. And I think it speaks to Willie's conversation about the distinction between societal and legal ways of understanding tenure. So thanks for that. Really fascinating stuff. Last but not least is Janine Felsen. So over to you, Janine.
Well, I'm looking at your time. You have 15 minutes and you want to have a conversation. I think you've gotten a lot from Willie and Alexi. I'm going to put my speaking notes aside and react a little bit to what we just heard. I think it's really fascinating, very, very different across small island developing states. As you know, the small island developing states defined within the context of the United Nations are 38 members, and about 20 non-UN members, I should mention, and they come from different areas. So you have the Caribbean, where I come from, then you have the Pacific, and then you have those that are located in Africa, who are in the Indian Ocean and have relationships with the South China Seas. So very different, and of course, very different legal contexts, all colonized. So to pick up from where Alexi started, where colonization has certainly impacted the way land and land rights are viewed and treated with. very different and very complex relationships that have been developed. In the Caribbean, I would say there's largely just the leasehold, freehold, leasehold, land tenure structure. But in the case of Belize, we've had confirmation of customary land rights for the Mayan people in Belize. And there's been a series of efforts to establish a commission to see how that can be enforced. Largely, their land tenure tends to be focused around in rural areas. So quite a different complex relationship when it comes to engaging in development-related projects. I come from an entirely different scale. I've worked largely to focus on how global policy is able to better address what is largely contextualized as a national issue. But we've tried in over 30 years of advocacy examine why these national issues are actually international issues, just because of the sheer a scale of pressures that are being placed on small island developing states from issues like climate change, of course, biodiversity loss, and the challenges that come with the various manifestation of those impacts, including loss of territory. So some of the questions that we necessarily have to ask would relate to how exactly will the maintenance of some of these indigenous or the local character of our various islands and the way in which they structure themselves, how will those be able to continue to be relevant or continue to establish our relationship for our people with our land, when in fact we're looking at the prospect that we might be losing our territory. We might be losing it because of sea level rise, and that might be complete inundation in some cases, or inundation where it just simply doesn't make it possible for land to be inhabitable. And what will necessarily from that is, we will have to rethink how our societies are structured. We have to rethink how our economies will thrive, and we have to rethink how we will relate to each other, because once there's challenges with resources, there are challenges amongst people in their relationships. So these are national issues, but they're created or exacerbated by international problems. And the question is, how then can frameworks outside, but inside, integrate some of these issues into our development prospects? So I think that's basically what I'll just leave it there, because you only have a few minutes left to engage, but I'm happy to respond to questions. I think speaking on the internationalization of some of these issues, I think it's also important not just to think within the context of, let's say, a resilience framework. There are many different frameworks that are being used to define the type of approaches that might be relevant to small island developing states. There's a justice framework, the climate justice framework. There's a framework, of course, of sustainable development, which is complementary to the resilience framework. There's a security framework. These issues that are challenging small island developing states are a threat to their security. There's a liability and compensation framework, which is related to historic responsibility of developed countries or former colonial countries. And then there's the issue as a matter of law. So the questions around sovereignty and territorial integrity. Willie's government Vanuatu is currently pursuing a possible advisory opinion before the International Court of Justice. This was something that was tried back in 2011, 2012 by Palau, but under pressure, they relented. And then there's a commission on small island states and sea level rise, spearheaded by Antigua and Barbuda, but also joined by Tuvalu and Palau. And of course, there's a growing interest in that. These are all approaches to try to determine, what are the options? What are the options for creating approaches for small island developing states to respond to these challenges in a way that maintains our local identity, but robustly addresses just the real impacts, physical impacts that we're facing. Thanks.
Thanks, Janine. Wow. I mean, I don't have any duties as chair now, because that basically summed up so nicely the kind of path that we're, looking out from this portal, we're looking into the future, maybe where we'd be trying to go. So that was perfect. I won't say any more summary comments. We'll just open the floor to questions. Does anybody want to ask anything of our panelists?
Jenny, I'll let you know if there's anything here in the room.
Okay. Also, panelists can ask questions if they're interested in other people's. Anoma is asking something. Can you tell us about some of the challenges of working in this area?
Anoma, did you want any of us in particular to respond to that?
She didn't ask for anyone in particular. Just she kind of opened it to everybody.
I'll start with a question.
Yeah,
I've got a question for Alexi. How big is the audience online?
About 18.
Okay, right. Which way should I face?
Oh, this
Okay.
down the panel.
It's for Alexi. You started with a series of really interesting sort of bites of how people in Honiara were talking, if you like, but then you only have 10 minutes, so you move on. And I think, okay, I wanted more about that. But then you end with a rather complex, very hierarchical diagram, which, as best I understand it, divides informal settlement in, was that Port Vila or
It was actually both, but yeah.
Okay, all right, into 13 different informal settlement types. And those types were categorized according to, first of all, as to whether they were regarded as being in the city or not, and then as to whether or not they had certain kinds of lease and whether or not those leases were contested. Right? So the informal settlements are divided into a typology according to formal criteria. Mm. So this is a kind of a top-down way of categorizing in what is really a kind of a bottom-up process. How do you think that the people who live in those settlements, do you think that would make sense to them? Or is there a disjunction between the way in which you're categorizing it from the top down and the way in which they might categorize it from their perspective?
And maybe we open that question also to Willie, because he's got, he may have some insights as well.
Absolutely. I can talk a bit about the diagram, Kim, if that's helpful. And Anoma, I could probably address your question as well, because this is the challenge, really, is, and I mean, Jenny and I have talked about this before, is how much of it fits with the state governance arrangements and targets that as a mechanism. And I think probably from my perspective as an outsider, that's a jurisdiction that I'm comfortable with. How much of that links to what's effective at stopping an eviction on the ground and negotiating upwards through those structures? I think Willie can talk much better to that, because I'm very conscious that, for example, there are some big differences between Port Vila and Honiara in terms of who holds customary jurisdiction. So in much of the peri-urban areas of Honiara, that's alienated land, and there are actually no legal rights for the customary landowners. But because of the history, there's a whole bunch of grey, for example, people will pay, even if they're within the town boundary, the customary landowners money, because when there have been attempts to formalise where the town boundary is, and I mean physically putting pegs in the ground, they've been ripped up and disputed because it's never been agreed with the customary owners who holds that land. And again, Willie, you could talk much more clearly about this, but I think that recently there have been some movements to sort of clarify this, but there are multiple customary landowner groups around the edges of Port Vila, and the the actual alienated land that is the sort of the center of that greater metropolitan area is contested by at least 3 or potentially 5 of those landowner groups. So I think from memory, Willie, you were talking about the Afira people who occupy an island that's just to the west of the center of the CBD. But there are also Erekor, Eratap to the south. There's Pango. There's a group that don't have clear delineations to who holds which land, but it is established under the Constitution that customary land rights, and this was what Willie was going to have preeminence over the state-based legal tenure systems. So I mean, it's not really answering your question. I'm sorry, Kim, but I think that they serve different purposes, and I think my purpose in developing that typology was to nuance the understanding of what informality is, to go to those donor organizations and say, you just want to work in informal settlements, to take that a little bit further and say, that is not enough of a different set of settings to feed up into the state governance systems that operate in those particular countries. And here's some examples of how that operates differently. Because all too often, let's say UN Habitat for the sake of one particular organization, that they'll have a program that deals with slums, which isn't even a term that's useful in those contexts, but they won't be able to say, we want to focus on the poorest parts of the city, so we'll just have a program that operates and assumes that none of you have any form of tenure security. Whereas in Honiara, despite some of the settlers who occupy that peri-urban space having lived there for 3 generations, and some of the people I've interviewed have said, no, I'm from Malaita, and they haven't even physically been to Malaita ever. But that's where their customary place is. So again, I think I'm probably cutting far too much into Willie's territory, Jenny. So I might defer to Willie on some sort of further reflections from on the ground. And then I see, Janine, you've got your hand up too.
We'll give Willie the comment, and then Janine the last comment. She's got her hand up. My apologies, we will run a little bit over, I think. So it won't be impolite at all if you must leave and you drop off the call or you leave the Japanese room. We understand. Willie, the question from Kim, Professor Dovey, was about how the experience of people in their communities, if you may react to Alexi's typology of informal settlements as being informal according to judiciary standards or societal standards. So I don't know if you heard him or not. But did you have anything you wanted to add to that from your perspective?
Sure, Jenny. Thank you. I think thank you, Alexis, for that diagram as well. As Alexis mentioned, when we're looking at those even Pacific islands like Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, the way of let me really bring back to what is happening on the ground is that in Vanuatu, the definition of defining the land areas must really come from the landowner, and to define that. And the area where the tobacco is a very interesting area because there is an overlap between what we call the urban area and the peri-urban and rural area as well. And it's really complex area between that boundary where the families are, because it have that overlap between what we call the urban area, the peri-urban area, and it's also considered as a rural area. And that is where, if I going back a little bit, after the independence, when the government calls out for the people that have owned the land at that time to reapply for having the land lease on what the land have during the colonial government. Some of the people reclaim that those land, and this is where, when looking at how the land is redivided in Port Vila, is most what we call the urban area. It's really where the government really owns in Port Vila, and then beyond that we have the customary land. Really, if some of them are within the urban area, within the Port Vila, the capital city itself. For instance, just 3 months ago, there is the people from Ifira reclaiming the custom area, which just beside the seafront area, which is the main capital in the main town, and claiming that piece of land is a customary land. And from that question is, in Vanuatu, and I don't really know the context in Solomon Island, but most of the customary land are defined by the local landowners, the people that are sort of indigenous from that island or that communities of that land, and then resurveyed by the government. But that the area where we define as urban is really where the US setting up the camp during the World War II, and after that, and I'm sure it's maybe same is in on Yarra as well. And the challenge is this: is where the government and the landowners agrees on whether the land must be a sort of a state land or a land that is customary land. And this is a sort of some sort of battle that we see, and even that case for Tepako, we can really also confront ourselves to that question of, is it a state land or is it a customary land that we have been settling in Tepako? So that question of based on what Alexis shared about the diagram, whether it's coming from the top down or bottom up. In Vanuatu, as I see with how the settlement is happening, it's more bottom down, bottom up, where really the customary people are fighting between them to find their landmarks according to what they have in their histories. And the complex, what's really complicated that is that settlement during the World War II, where really defined that this is the urban area and it will belong to the state.
Thanks, Willie. Okay, great. I've just, yep, no worries. We'll give Janine the last word, and I'll just say a little goodbye, and then we'll get out and let you go on with your day. Janine, over to you.
Actually, I'm just going to tackle the questions together. So Noma's questions and the other question about the tool, which I will refer to Alex's chart as. I think it really demonstrates the complexity of dealing with different frameworks. It's, I think, convenient, as we've seen in many development agencies and financial institutions. It's convenient to be able to sort of simplify their engagement with communities. Well, typically it's with government. So let's park that discussion about even engaging with communities. It's easier to put us in categories, to put countries in categories. So you have with the World Bank, they put countries in a spectrum of categories: low income, middle income, high income. They don't treat with high income on concessionary grant bases. Some middle income countries, they do low income, yes. Vanuatu, if I'm not mistaken, you're graduated now out of LDC category. So you have a whole new way of engaging with the donor community, but it's largely at the national level, not the community level. So I think what the utility of, so it makes it very complicated, Anoma. So I think the utility of something that Alexei has created is partly to create that sensitization that we don't all fit into a neat little box that you can engage in and effectively address the needs of the people of where you want to have impact. So I'll end at that. I think it is a negotiation of frameworks that we're dealing with. There is an absolute need for a more inclusive consultative process when you do engage with these different frameworks. It's something systemic. It doesn't exist at the global level. There are mechanisms at the local level, and it's a question of how you marry the two. It needs to be a creative process of co-creation or co-designing or whatever the correct lingo is here in the academic world. But this is what we're doing. We're negotiating across frameworks, and we need to be sensitive to local context. Thank you.
We'll wrap up the seminar there. Thank you so much, Willie and Alexei, for your really thoughtful illustrations of the complexity of this issue. you too, Janine, and also for sacrificing your time to speak about your own work, but to bring some insights from your background into the interpretation of the Pacific, which I think, you just leaped across geographies there. So we really appreciate you. And I'm so excited to have this faculty seminar going on. Join us in the next Southern Design Seminar, which I think is coming up in April. So stay tuned to that. And everyone, thanks for sticking with us for the extra 7 minutes, and have a great day. I'm going to stay on here just to make sure everything's all right. But our participants, I think you wouldn't miss anything at this point if you head off. Our speakers too. So whatever you want.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thanks.